This last story will kind of lead us into our main news segment of the week. But Colorado, as you said, the assault weapon ban bill that was introduced was officially rejected, even after lawmakers offered to water it down a bit. That comes to us from the Colorado Sun. But that's definitely a big step because Colorado is a triple blue state and they've made gun control a really big priority this session. And yet in the very first committee hearing, this assault weapon ban bill was given the axe.
Yeah. And you wrote a whole members piece on this about what it potentially means for this sort of resurgence of assault weapons bans. We talked about this a little bit in the past, where, I think I had a piece initially like last year saying that assault weapons bans, the era of them is over. And that was based on, the polling has been going in the opposite direction. It's been trending against assault weapons bans in the vast majority of polls out there. I think the YouGov poll is sort of the one big outlier where they're still finding like 60% plus support. But basically every other major pollster has found a decrease in support to the point where now the latest polling, which is still, they don't do these polls every week or whatever, like you see with approval pollings, but it's actually turned against assault weapons bans on the national scale, at least. And then obviously the Supreme Court's ruling in Bruin casts a lot of doubt on the constitutionality of these laws because they're modern laws that don't seem to have historical analogs dating back to the founding era. Obviously, the courts, that's what's the fight in the courts is going to be about. So we'll see where the federal judges come down on this ultimately, and if the Supreme Court steps in. But, it turned out that wasn't quite right. We've seen now a resurgence in at least deeper blue states. As we just mentioned there, Washington follows Illinois, which followed Delaware in adopting state level bans. And obviously the House last year passed its own version of an assault weapons ban on the national level. Now that didn't go anywhere after the House passed it, and it's not likely to come back up again in this Congress. But you have seen a bit of movement in this way, a bit of momentum for gun control advocates who want to ban AR-15s and AK-47s and other guns that are affected by these laws. As we've mentioned before, an assault weapon ban is a fairly nebulous term. It means different things depending on what state you're in and what their definition of assault weapon is. Usually it's semi-automatic firearm that accepts a detachable magazine, is center fire, and has one or two of a list of banned features like telescoping stocks or barrel shrouds or pistol grips, things of that nature. And again, each state seems to have a different definition of what an assault weapon is, just like most states have a different definition of what a large capacity magazine is. Some it's 10 rounds, some it's 15, some it's 17, some it's different for rifles than it is for handguns. You get the idea. But it seems now with this Colorado defeat that these proposals are bumping up against political reality, right? That's what you wrote this week.
Yeah, it's sort of a Rorschach test, right? Because you could look at the momentum of Delaware, Illinois, Washington and say, wow, maybe this is a sustained resurgence. But over the same period, you've seen triple blue states now pretty quickly reject assault weapon bans. So not only Colorado this week, but New Mexico earlier during this legislative session also pretty quickly killed an assault weapon ban, and they're a triple blue state. You have new Democratic trifectas in Minnesota and Michigan this year that have also made gun control a really big political priority, and an assault weapon ban has not been a part of that list. So you're seeing the very real politics of a hardware ban butt up against this new renewed momentum, at least among the gun control activist class, to try to pass these. And as you said, those same overarching underlying features of the Bruin decision and public opinion are also still present. So when you're hitting up against the sort of the extent of your political runway, and then you have impending judicial rulings coming down the line, it's sort of like a closing window for this resurgence, if it even is a resurgence.
Right. That's the big difference, right, between assault weapons bans and the sort of streak that they've been on, and permitless carry, right, which also saw Nebraska come through and adopt that policy this week. making it the 27th state to do so. But you still have a couple, the permitless carries playing field is really shrinking. The possible states that are going to be relatively easy pickups are now already picked up. So you still have the Carolinas, you've got Louisiana maybe. You have states where they've passed these laws or they're controlled by Republicans, where you could see this still happening, but that's not a lot of states left that are likely to go that direction. The big difference, though, as you just alluded to there, is permitless carry activists can just keep chipping away at this. They can keep chipping away at opposition to the law. They can keep trying to vote out people who won't support it, so on and so forth. In Louisiana, for instance, they could, if they change the governor to somebody who supports permitless carry, basically they'll win. And so they could just wait till the next election to do that. Or they can elect more supporters in the legislature to the point where they can override a veto, reliably, and get it through that way. And so they have time, and they can continue to move on this. Whereas with the assault weapons bans, it seems fairly clear that they're not going to be constitutional for much longer. We're still waiting on rulings in California and Maryland, but I think you talked about what there were some warning signs. I mean, obviously you've got the Supreme Court. One of the first things they did after Bruin was grant, vacate, and remand a number of cases. One of them was the Maryland assault weapons ban case that the Fourth Circuit had previously said that the ban was constitutional, and the Supreme Court is now saying, go back and look at this again under our new standard, which, look, it doesn't mean that it's guaranteed that they're not explicitly saying this is wrong and these laws are unconstitutional, but it's the closest thing you're going to get to that, I would say. But there's another reason, right, to think that the court is going to go in the direction of declaring these unconstitutional.
Yeah, if you look at
your piece.
Yeah. So one of the sitting members of the current Supreme Court, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, was at one point a D.C. Circuit Appeals Court judge, and he has a pretty famous dissenting opinion on the district's own assault weapons ban that got before his court. Now, it was a dissent, but he wrote a pretty lengthy dissent analyzing that ban under what he called the text, history, and tradition standard, which is virtually identical to the new standard that's been articulated by Bruin. Which is essentially what all these other courts now have to use to evaluate whatever assault weapons ban, whether it's Maryland's or there's a case out of California and there's a smattering of other cases around the country. And so if he's already spelled out sort of the test using history and tradition where this ban would be unconstitutional, that's kind of a pretty big indicator that, at least according to the high court, that's how they think this ought to end up.
Yeah. So the assault weapons ban advocates are butting up against the political reality of how difficult it is to pass new gun bans in America, even in very blue states. But they're also running out of time likely to do it because the courts seem primed to step in and say these restrictions are not constitutional.